Ahoy hoy, I'm Planarwalk, and this is going to be a difficult video because I've got two challenges. The first is keeping people that aren't from New Zealand engaged in New Zealand politics, and the second is to inform New Zealanders about New Zealand politics. Now, the reason why I'm making this video is because in New Zealand, we are about to have an election, depending on what happens with COVID, of course. And it seems that during election time, nobody really knows what's going on with politics. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of the 5 parties that actually have seats and give you a sort of overview of what their platform is. And I'll also try to add context for non-New Zealanders that are watching this video because, let's face it, a lot of eyes are on New Zealand right now. So to start with, I have a few criticisms of the platforms in general of Labour, National and New Zealand First, especially New Zealand First. I was trying to find their policies in this upcoming election for ages. I even tried to contact them, got no response except for an email saying, "Thank you for your feedback." And the only thing that I could find were news articles stating some of their policies and their 15 fundamental principles, which weren't really all that detailed. Which brings me to my main criticisms of Labour's platform. They could definitely be more detailed on some of their policies. Their slogan is "Let's keep moving," so I'd like to know how exactly we're going to be moving. And I also don't like how a large part of their platform is "We did good during COVID-19, so elect us again," because that's very much circumstantial. It's only because they happen to be in power that we got to see what they do during COVID-19. And we don't get to see that with National because National wasn't in power during COVID-19. Maybe they would have done better, maybe they would have done worse, we don't know. Which brings me on to the criticisms of National's platform, because I did not realise that the New Zealand Transport Agency was actually able to lobby political parties, because they certainly seem to have done that for National. Half of National's platform is literally just roads, trains, and buses. They could literally just rename the infrastructure section on their website to transport, and it wouldn't make any difference because that's what the infrastructure section is. Transport. I would have thought that Jerry Brownlee, who just looks like a clone of Clive Palmer by the way, so I'm just going to call him Budget Clive Palmer from now on, would have learnt from his experience in rebuilding Christchurch that there's more to infrastructure than transport. Although there are cases to be made that he didn't do such a good job with that, but that's not the focus of this video. Now, if you think I'm being too hard on Labour and National, I can actually forgive some of the flaws in their platforms. They're both going through a pretty rough time right now. For example, Labour being part of the government in power right now does have a lot to deal with the coronavirus, so it's understandable why their policies might not be as detailed as I'd like them to be. And National is very busy going through the process of completely imploding in on itself until there is nothing but dust, from which Winston Peters and New Zealand First will rise as the new opposition party. Now, for anyone wondering who Winston Peters is, he's the leader of the New Zealand First party, and I'm pretty sure that when he dies, New Zealand First is just going to reanimate his corpse so that they can keep him as leader. Now, a few notable figures that non-New Zealanders will need to know about before we move forward is Jacinda, I think everyone knows about her already. She is the current Prime Minister and the leader of the Labour Party, which is the main left-wing party in New Zealand. The next is Simon Bridges. Karen. Judith Collins. Wait, are you sure her name's not Karen? She is the leader of National, which is the main right-wing party in New Zealand. But it is to the left of the Democrats over in America. And I've already mentioned Budget Clive Palmer, who is the deputy leader of the National Party, as well as Winston Peters, who is currently the deputy prime minister. Oh, and everyone loves Winston Peters until he's criticising their favourite politician. Now on to actual policy, because that's what's actually important here. Now every party that I'm talking about has policy on justice, except for New Zealand First, which I couldn't find most of their policies anyway. And all the policies there do seem pretty similar, although National did go into more detail as opposed to New Zealand First, who went into no detail. A fair bit of focus is being put on serious crimes, especially by ACT and the Greens, and a running theme seems to be the rehabilitation of criminals, as well as support for victims. And another prominent theme is helping people out with addiction issues, Now, one difference that I did notice about National is I couldn't find any reference to wanting to reduce the prison population, even though they have more information on what they want to do with law and order. And ACT, Labour, and the Greens all do want to do that. Now, another issue that every party has policies on is the environment. Although New Zealand First is very bare bones, so we're not going to talk about that. Although maybe they do have more detailed policies, but I just couldn't find them. I mean, I did try and contact them. Thank you for your feedback. Now, when it comes to environmental policies, it is very disconcerting that National appears to have no mention of climate change or greenhouse gases. Although, to be fair, their website does say that more policy will be announced, so maybe we will get something on greenhouse gases or climate change after they've finished imploding in on themselves. Now, one of ACT's policies on climate change I actually found really interesting, and I do agree with, and that is to cut flights taken by politicians by 25%. The whole idea there is to get politicians to lead by example when it comes to climate change, as well as slightly reducing government spending. As for Labour and the Greens, Labour wants to work with farmers to try and find ways in which emissions can be reduced, and the Greens want to stop subsidies to fossil fuel companies. It also seems like the Greens want to have some kind of tax for companies that produce greenhouse gases as a way of disincentivizing that. There are also other environmental policies such as clean waterways, protecting New Zealand's native animals, and promoting biodiversity, which pretty much every party is in favour of. Now, whilst we're on the subject of the environment, let's talk about transport, which is a huge part of the National platform. So the good thing about National here is they know exactly what they want to do. I'm not going to go through it all because that would take a long time, but they have a plan, which is good. But when it comes to Labour and the Greens, they have very similar policies, although their policies are more of, we will invest in rail, bus and roads. Now, when it comes to National's transport projects, they seem to be more focused on jobs and growing the economy, whereas Labour and the Greens seem to be more focused on the environment and easing congestion. Now, that isn't to say that those are the only things that the parties are focusing on, because obviously National wants to ease congestion. I mean, that's a given. I'm just saying that these are the main things in their pitches. And also, Labour and the Greens do want to move more towards electric vehicles, which includes building electric vehicle power stations. Now, ACT's policies on public transport are rather different. They want to work more with the private sector rather than it just being decided by the government, but they also want to introduce something called road pricing to incentivise people to use public transport more. Now, essentially what road pricing is it's charging people to use roads. This might be in the form of toll gates. I don't see this being very popular, even if it does achieve its desired outcome. Now, some people might be wondering, what's New Zealand First's policies on transport? And you think they have policies on transport that I could find? Thank you for your feedback. But anyway, the next thing is housing, which, surprise, surprise, New Zealand First doesn't appear to have anything on, nor does National. Now, when it comes to the Greens, they want to protect people who rent from unreasonable rent increases, which I can totally get behind. But then they also want to have warrant of fitness checks for rental houses. I feel like these two things, they don't go all too well together. Even if the warrant of fitness is free, getting a house up to standard, especially if it's not quite at standard, can cost a fair bit of money, which can cause rent increases. But that being said, I do think that it is fair to have minimum rental conditions, which I'm pretty sure we already had. But when it comes to ACT's policy on housing, it is removing restrictions on building to lower costs. Now, ACT's policy is more about what land you can build on. Labour has a policy that scraps the need for consent to build certain things like a sleep out. Now, this doesn't apply to a whole house, but instead applies to low-risk building work, which would usually be more of an addition for a house. Now, this shouldn't come as any surprise, but Labour and the Greens want to build more state housing, which I think is good. Now, something that I want to touch rather briefly on is tax, because when it comes to ACT's tax policy, it starts off really good, but then loses me after that. So I am a strong believer in cutting GST, at least for goods traded in New Zealand, and ACT wants to do that, but only for a year. Now I do get the idea behind it. Lowering GST should lower prices, which would encourage spending to stimulate the economy. But do we really need to raise GST back up to 15% if we were to reduce it to 10% for a year? I don't think so. Now the other part of ACT's tax policy is to reduce the income tax of people that earn between $48,000 and $70,000 from 30% down to 17.5%. Now, I don't think that this is a good policy. I think that it would be much more productive to reduce tax for people earning under $20,000 a year, for example. I think that would be far better. To me, a tax cut like this benefits rich people far more than it benefits poor people. You know, poor people that actually need more money. Now, one of the other parties that might reduce tax is New Zealand First, but there's no information on what tax they might reduce or how much they might reduce it by. Thank you for your feedback. Now the Greens do want tax reform, and it appears that they want the tax system to be more progressive than what it is, which would mean that the rich would pay a lot more in tax, whilst the poor might get certain tax breaks. But that is assuming that when they say that the system should be progressive, that they're meaning more progressive than what it is now, and not just, oh yeah, we've got a progressive system, let's just keep that. Another tax that the Greens would like to introduce is capital gains tax, which I think is a good idea. A capital gains tax essentially means that if you've got an asset that is increasing in value over time, and you sell that asset to get your money back, and you get more money than what you put into it, you'll be taxed on that extra money that you got. Now my justification for this tax is if you don't tax people on capital gains, then people with a lot of money that are able to invest will invest, and they will be making an income that they don't have to pay tax on. Now, tax does tie pretty strongly into the economy, which is the next point that I'm going to bring up, because National does seem pretty strong on this. Now, every party is trying to help small and medium businesses, but National actually wants to help businesses get started, which I think is a good thing. Now, the way that National's policy would work is you would be able to get a $1,000 voucher to get help in order to develop a business proposal. If your proposal is approved, you would be able to access up to $20,000 from your KiwiSaver account in order to start your business. Now, of course, this does pose a bit of a problem for people that don't have a KiwiSaver account or don't have a lot of money in the KiwiSaver account, but it's way better than nothing. There is also something about a $5,000 tax credit, well, two $5,000 tax credits, but the wording is really strange to me, so if you can figure out what exactly they're trying to say, please do let me know in the comments. But back to the more mundane stuff, when it comes to the economy, yeah, every party wants to try and create more jobs, and one of the good things that I do like about every party's policies when it comes to economics is they do tie it to all their other policies, which I think is good. Although I know that I am beating a dead horse when I say this doesn't really apply to New Zealand First. Now, one of the things that ACT wants to do to try and help the economy is they want to repeal the Zero Carbon Act. I don't think that will help the economy too much, and I think it's better to keep the Zero Carbon Act in place. And also, I feel like there's also a pun that can be made there. The ACT Party and the Zero Carbon Act? No? Okay. Now, one of the things that the Greens have considered that not many other parties have considered is ICT and its role in the economy, because that sector will become more important as time goes on. In fact, when it comes to ICT, the Greens have a whole host of issues that they want to address that no other party is talking about. For example, they want government databases to be publicly available except for the databases that hold personal information. For those databases, they only want the information to be available as an aggregate so that people cannot be identified from it. Another thing that the Greens would like to do is promote the use of free and open source software, which I think is pretty good because I am right now using some open source software. That is OBS. The way in which the Greens would like to achieve this is to allow software to be copyrighted, but to not allow it to be patented. This of course would aim to prevent events such as when Namco patented mini-games in loading screens of video games. And of course, because it's the Green Party, get ready to be shocked, they're wanting to tackle the problem of e-waste. Surprise. Now, one policy position that is kind of redundant for this election is immigration, because currently, if you're not a New Zealand citizen, you're not allowed to come into New Zealand. Now, this is where I'm going to get into some of the more interesting policies that I found, because it seems that some parties, mostly ACT and the Greens, have some rather interesting policies. Now, whether you actually agree with these policies or not is a completely different issue, but they're still interesting to say the least. Okay, so let's start with ACT wants to abolish the Human Rights Commission. No, I am not making this up. This is one of their policies that you can go and check right now on their website. The reason for this is because they want to roll back hate speech laws because Muffrey's peach. Now, I think that most people would agree that free speech is important. You don't want to become like North Korea. However, when it comes to hate speech, a lot of hate speech is pretty much harassment. And also, I'm pretty sure that the Human Rights Commission does a lot more than just go, oh, this is hate speech and this is hate speech. So abolishing the Human Rights Commission all in all seems like a pretty bad idea. So the next interesting policy that I found is from the Greens, and that is a UBI. So for those of you who do not know what UBI is Universal Basic Income, and it is a set amount of money that every citizen of a country gets each week. The idea of UBI is to just pay for everybody's basic needs, such as rent and food. This means that working a job is more to afford luxury items rather than just simply working to survive. This means that if people are unable to work for whatever reason, they will still have money available, and I feel like we can link that back to an event that has happened recently. It also means that when all the jobs are being taken over by automation, people still have an income, which is pretty important. Now, the way in which the Greens plan to implement UBI is essentially have it replace the benefit, but not all benefits, just the job seeker benefit. So this means that if you were to have a disability, for example, you'd get a UBI, but on top of it, you'd still get your disability allowance. This is important because UBI cannot always accommodate extra costs, such as the cost of having a disability. Now, there is an obvious downside to UBI, and that is it is very expensive. So the government would need to implement something like higher taxes in order to be able to afford it. Now, the next interesting policy is one from ACT, and like the Greens, they would like to completely change the benefit system. However, they don't want to implement a UBI. They instead want to implement employment insurance, which means that if you are employed for a certain amount of time and then lose your job, you are then entitled to a benefit. This is not an indefinite benefit though. The benefit that you get is proportional to how long you were employed for. Now, is it just me, or does this seem like a really bad idea? I mean, finding a job is difficult enough as it is, especially in today's current landscape. Now, not only is finding a job rather difficult, if you've got no money because you don't qualify for employment insurance, then finding a job becomes even more difficult when you don't have a place to live or can't afford food. Now, their pitch for this is to try and stop children from being born into households that are dependent on a benefit. However, there's a teensy little problem with that. Poor people have a lot of kids, and rich people have fewer kids. Cutting poorer people off from a benefit isn't going to change that. If you want to stop poor people from having so many kids, you want to make them richer, not poorer. And also, another one of ACT's policies that would make the employment insurance policy even worse is to raise the superannuation age from 65 to 67. So yes, more people looking for jobs with a terrible benefit system totally doesn't sound like a shit show. Now, I should mention that Labour does have a plan for the benefit. It's just not as interesting as ACT or the Greens. So Labour wants to increase the benefit by $25 for everyone on it, as well as increase the winter energy payments. And the last interesting policy that I want to mention is from the Greens, because the Greens would like to abolish the GCSB. The reason being is because they think that New Zealand should not spy on its citizens on behalf of other countries. Now, whilst this policy isn't very high up on my priority list, I still think it's good as it does give New Zealand citizens a certain level of privacy. But anyway, that is it for this video. I didn't go through every single policy that every single party has because otherwise we'd just be here for hours on end. I just went through some of the major points that I thought were rather important, and those points may be subject to bias as a lot of things in politics are. I may have described some good policies in a bad way, and I may have described some bad policies in a good way, which is why I urge people to do your own research before voting. Don't just vote for a party because you've always voted for that party. Vote for a party because you agree with their policies. I voted for Labour in the last election, and this election I will probably vote for the Greens. And also, parties will have new policies between now and the election, so don't just go, I'm definitely voting for National or I'm definitely voting for Labour right now, because a new policy might come up that you like or dislike. For example, I'm not too keen on some of the Greens' seemingly anti-GMO policies, and if they were the policies that the Greens were pushing really hard, then I probably wouldn't vote for them. But anyway, a big shout out to my $20 or more patrons. What Jesus, Hugh Jarsz, M.C.Nutkin, Wolfie, and Morrie. If you want to support me financially, click on the link here. But I will see you in the next video. Between you and me, thank you for watching.